Alright, so fundamentals of domain-driven design. You already have the booklet. Maybe you can just read that and I just go back and sit at the chair and you wait for Indu to start. or I could talk about it. Well, let's talk about what is a domain. So if I take the definition straight from the dictionary, it says it's an area, specified sphere of activity or knowledge. So we all work in a specific area, right? Right now I'm working in an auto insurance claim processing company that builds the software to process those claims. Some of us work in finance industry and you're in a really hardcore software company. She works for particular software and closely works with in-service bus. So if we take the definition from the book for what is domain-driven design, Eric says it's the idea of tackling the complexity in the heart of the software. What is the complexity in the heart of the software? It is the domain. So domain-driven design, okay, our pizza is here. So what is domain-driven design? It is actually a software design that's focused on the domain concept. You build the software that speaks your domain language. Why should we use DDD? Well, one thing is for better design. When you actually build your software around the domain language, your classes, your methods, every component of the software reflects and talks the domain language. It naturally moves you towards following some of the principles like single responsibility principle. Because when you're creating the classes, thinking what the responsibilities are going to be, how are they going to operate, you try to segregate the responsibilities accordingly. It also helps you understand your domain problem, and it helps you apply that knowledge to solve the problem that you have. It helps you communicate effectively, and we'll actually talk about how does it really help you communicate effectively. But before we go there, what are the problems with domain-driven design? Did anybody find out any problem?
I give you a page full.
Huh?
I can give you a page full of files.
Okay, I would like to know about them right after this meetup. But a lot of people will say, oh, it's really complicated, or it requires domain expertise, or it encourages you to do iterative development. But those are good problems to have actually. For me to really work as a developer, I really want to understand what my domain is about before I actually write the software. I actually have this experience in many places where I'm told to create a specific controller and to write a specific action instead of telling me, here's what my customer wants. And I would rather have somebody tell me what the customer needs than to tell me that I should create a controller, because I'm a developer, I know I would have to do something like that. Okay, so how does it help you to communicate better? Here are two people, everybody knows Adam and Eve, and they're having really hard time talking to each other, right? It's like Adam is speaking in Spanish and Eve is speaking French, and they just don't know how to communicate. So ubiquitous language, if you really go by the dictionary, ubiquitous means it's present everywhere, it's found everywhere. So it's about creating the language that everybody speaks in that domain. Your business analyst, your customers, your developers, you all share the same vocabulary, the same language. And when you communicate using the same language, you communicate more effectively. You communicate faster, you can convey your ideas much easier. If I would say, if I click on that button X, Y happens, that wouldn't really make sense. But if I say, in order for a user to log in, or the user will land on this page or will do this and X would happen or Y would happen, you're trying to really show, okay, here's what the customer wants to do, and as a developer, I want to reflect that in my code. Bounded context. So, what is bounded context? If you really go by the term by itself, it says that it's bounded. The context of the problem is bounded in certain area. So let's actually go with this picture. If you see that there are these two different contexts here, there is sales and then there is support, and you can see that customer and product are present in both of these contexts. Does that mean they imply the same thing? They may be similar things, but they are not exactly the same thing. The way sales look at a customer or a product could be really different than how support thinks about it. There may be some dependency. Maybe a customer from the support might reference a customer from sales in some way. So you may have to have some kind of mapping, which is the idea we call context mapping. But they're still different, and they have to have their own separate bounded context. I want to talk about one of the examples from house insurance policies. If you see, like the policy has different meaning in different contexts. If you think about the underwriting, there is a policy in that area, and if you think about claims, they have their policy. The policy from claims might depend on the policy from underwriting, but they are not the same thing. They have Stingies.
Hey, Gumties.
I introduced Stingies already. He was the former organizer of this meetup, and thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, and Gumties you call very successfully. How are you?
So I was talking about another example of bounded context and how the policies from underwriting and from claims, they differ, but they might communicate with each other. I have another example. So I used to work at a company where, and here I'm trying to show a problem with actually how not using a proper bounded context can create a problem. So I used to work at a company where we work together. I'm not going to name it. It's the term SKU, order item, and product were used interchangeably. If somebody would say product, somebody would say SKU, and somebody would say order item, and I was confused all the time. And I didn't know what they meant by one or the other. They shared a lot of different attributes. Here's what I noticed over time. In the core domain that I worked in, product was the right term to use. That was the knowledge of the domain model. But SKU or order item did not apply. They could be coming from some other subdomains and they could have a specific meaning somewhere else, but they were not the right terms to use. And you would see multiple classes created with different names, but were doing pretty much the same thing. And that's where it becomes really hard when you try to mix different terms or specific concepts from the domain model in one specific domain, and your language starts becoming really blurry. And on that, I want to expand the idea of core domain. So you may work with other domains. So for example, I may have, say, retail, but I may depend on marketing, I may depend on sales. Those are subdomains. Those are going to support me, but that's not where my focus should be. And the language that I have my core domain should not bring in the vocabulary from those other domains. Okay, so if you want to learn more on DDD, I would really recommend these two books. I would say that for the domain-driven design by Eric Evans, start with section 4 from the strategic design. Otherwise, it'll be really hard to get through the book. I really like the domain-driven design book by Bob Gorman. He actually has 2 versions. He also has the shorter version called Domain-Driven Design Distilled. I actually started from there and made it easier for me to get to Eric Evans' book. I haven't still fully gotten through that book. With that, I actually wanted to introduce my next speaker, Indu Lagersami, and she works at Particular Software, who is the creator of N-Service Bus, and many of us actually use it heavily in our organizations. She's a distributed system expert. She speaks at many different conferences about event-driven architecture, reliable software design, and I actually met her when I attended her talk on microservices at the Explore DDD conference. She is hardcore into rock climbing, and that's what she does when she is not actually speaking somewhere. And with that, thank you so much. I'll let Thank you.
So, yeah, thanks, Gomati, for that brilliant introduction. And so what I want to talk about today is like some of what Gomati touched upon, which is bounded context. And I've worked with event-driven architecture and messaging a long time. And for me, it was like trying to understand this concept around domain-driven design, which is bounded context, which I think is one of the most important concepts. And then like trying to combine that with event-driven architecture, I felt like that kind of like opened up like a whole realm of like areas where the software design could be better and reliable and so on. So that's kind of like what I want to talk about. Hey, hooray. We heard enough about me. So I work for Particular Software, and I want to thank my company for actually helping sponsor some of the costs for this meetup. So I wanted to give a shout out to them. My company also makes the N-Service Bus framework, which is a messaging framework for .NET applications, makes messaging easier. So that's the spiel about Particular Software. So, okay, a small story. I am known as the iPhone killer of the family. So I drop my phones, and I have this very like stubborn thing of like, I don't want to have a phone case, and my kids just can't get that. So my daughter ended up like buying me a case for the phone, and it came a note with, you're gonna hate it, but you're gonna need it. With the note, but so this is like one of the cases that we're looking at, but you know, they wanted like a heavy duty, go fling on the wall, it's still not going to break. But for a lot of you who already know about bounded context, I'll try to be, you know, bear with me, and I want to just give a little bit of introduction about like why this is necessary, sort of thing. And also I would love your feedback. This is like the talk that I'm going to present at Explore DDD. So this is sort of like the beta version of the talk. So I would love to hear your feedback, where I could be better, what things I was not able to explain clearly, or what things you would like to know more about. There's a feedback wall out there with a happy face and a sad face. So if you can add your comments on the post-it, that would be fabulous for me. So let's look at this page. So in this page, there's a lot of information about this phone case. There's the picture, there's a name, there's a description. There's a whole bunch of stuff, like what, you know, how much of it's available, etc. So we try to model this, and we come up, like, you know, we have years and years of object orientation or principles or like modeling experience that we try to automatically come up with this mental model in our heads, and which is like, hey, we have a product, and the product has a name, the product has a description, an image, dimensions, and so on. So you sort of build this idea of this thing in your head, and it somewhat looks like this. But the actual idea of what a product is might depend on who you talk to. Like Gomti was talking about like this SKU, and like, you know, some people refer it as SKU, and some people refer it as the order item, and so on. So different people in different teams, based on what they're doing or dealing with that idea, have like completely, you know, they call it as a product, but there are different rules attached to it. There's different processes attached to it, but we end up calling it as a product. So depending on the sales team, it's like, for them, like the images and the description and like the customer reviews might be the most important thing. But for like, person in shipping, it's like, hey, is it something that's perishable or non-perishable? What are the rules around, regulations around shipping that? Like that might be the most important thing. So depending on like who you talk to, things could mean different things. So that's kind of where the unified model falls flat. So when we start thinking about like modeling the entire thing as like, one model, now we're all of a sudden trying to fit these different rules and different things inside this same model, and it kind of becomes complicated, unwieldy, and then when you're trying to communicate, it's like so confusing. And like you said, Gomthi, there's duplications of code, and now all of a sudden it's hard. And like people start sometimes writing new modules just because like they're afraid to touch a certain module. It's like I worked for, like in my past, there was this 2,000 line function, and like people were like afraid to like touch that, because if you touch that, you're gonna break something, and that's gonna like stop a lot of things. So there's risk involved. So what people end up doing is like you start writing, oh, I'm not gonna touch that, I'm just gonna write this small thing, and now all of a sudden there's duplication. So within this model, there's duplication, contradiction, so it becomes super hard. So that's why we want to split this model into different things. So I think of bounded context as a safe space. So it's a space where models kind of like, are free. They are very specific to what they do, and they share the same language. And in that space, they're consistent. So the product that talks about SKU is very consistent and about the rules, and so anything that describes the product, the rules, could live in this one space. And so for example, it also provides you clarity. Now, when you're looking, rather than like this big giant model, and like in that previous project, there were more than 200 tables, and there was one transaction table. It was called transaction table, and it had like, I can't count, but it had more than 100 fields. And people just kept adding stuff because they didn't want to touch stuff. So instead of that, now you have your models have this space, and in this space just have things that are relevant to that model. So you don't need to worry about the schema for other things that is related, that's unrelated. So whatever rules and stuff that your model needs is in this space. So it provides clarity, and it also provides freedom, because your team that's focused on claims just focuses on that area. The other team that's doing something else, they have their freedom to write their models without trying to duplicate or have these interdependencies. One of the problems is with the duplication and the complication is we look at a model and we think that, hey, this has all of the information, and so you try to reuse that. It's like, hey, this team already has this model, and I'm just going to reuse that thing in my context. But in your context, a lot of the things may not apply, and then you're reusing something, and the semantic meaning of what you're trying to reuse might be different in your context. And then in production, you might start finding weird bugs where you change it and in this module, and then the other teams seeing unexpected behavior. So it has these sort of unwieldy things, and so by separating, so by each team saying this is a model that I'm going to focus on, I'm not going to worry about what you call product in the other space, you have more freedom to evolve. So finding the boundaries, that's like almost like the hardest thing. So how do you know like whether something fits in one model versus like the other? So to me, that's like always been the hardest part of like bounded context. Like it's nice to talk about it, but like, you know, when you actually start getting into the nitty gritty, then it's like, okay, then you have a lot of questions like, does it go here or does it go there? So some ways are like when you look at your model, kind of ask yourself, do you need transactional consistency between like what's in that model? So for example, would you ever need to be in a position where you're updating the product description and say like, you know, the availability, the quantity at the same time? Do they need to be in the same transaction scope? If it doesn't, like what is it doing in the same model? It's clearly telling you it doesn't need that consistency, that logical consistency between those two items. So that's like one way you could think about like, hey, does this thing belong in my model or not? The other thing is like, sometimes it's just easier to split across the boundary of the team. So teams, departments. So like you were like Gomthi was like giving all my examples. But it's great because that shows the actual problem in the industry, right? Like that really shows or emphasizes like the problem that's being solved by domain-driven design. So rather than like have this one model, if you split models across teams, you're kind of like logically grouping all the rules that kind of go together. And so now you have different models and they can live in their separate contexts and have that clarity and freedom to evolve and so on. So in here, the product in sales has dimensions. The product in shipping has dimensions. But what dimensions mean to sales might be like the exact, like you know, hey, what does this weigh and how long is this or whatever. But for the shipping people, it's like, you know, does it fit in this size box, or, you know, the dimensions might be completely different. By having them be in different separate contexts, these contexts have the freedom to do what they want with that dimensions thing. So you've separated those models. The other thing is like when you're looking at each business process, that also can clue you in on like what are the information that you're going to need and how does the consistency work in order to implement that business process. So when you take a particular business process, it could sometimes go across bounded context, but it kind of like gives you that idea of like what information is needed from where. So you can like start thinking of what's the data that's available for this rule and how can I get that in order to form this business process. So like if you pay for, if you get the Amazon card, I'm going to give you a $70 discount. That is going to touch like different pieces of your models. So if you have different bounded contexts that's having these different models, that's giving you like a smaller version, or a smaller view of the problem. But for a system a system to communicate or a system to be cohesive, it might need to work with other bounded contexts. So these bounded contexts need to integrate with each other. So I wanted to, as an example, talk about like the airline, but I'll come to that. One way to integrate different bounded contexts is using messaging. And this is like where I found like, the intersection of messaging as a technology with DDD as a discipline. So DDD gives you this philosophy or a programming or a design discipline of if you do this, if you do these things, you're going to be good. But actually, to facilitate that, I find that like event-driven architecture and messaging play a very important role. So if you, in event-driven architecture, you express everything as a message, as an event. So what is an event? An event is something that has happened. An event is something that's a statement of truth. So one model is saying that something important has happened in that context. It's like an announcement to the rest of the context, saying like, this happened. So therefore, it's always expressed in a past tense. So when you say something has happened, and you're announcing it to the other context, so the other context can take that information and proceed and kick off like whatever processes they need to do when that event arrives. So that's why it's a statement of truth. Once you publish an event, you can't go back and say, that didn't happen because like you've got so many other subsystems that have relied on that statement of fact. So you only publish events when you're certain that they've happened, and you always publish them in the past tense. So then what is a command? Command is also a message, but a command is saying like, do something. So it's in the active verb. And commands can fail, commands can succeed. So it's like when inside, so commands I typically use from like within a bounded context. So you can have different pieces. A bounded context is something not just has like, one model, you can have different models in there, like, but the most important thing is like anything in this space is using the same language, is consistent, logically, is applicable to that model. So you could have different services in that bounded context space, but as long as they are consistent, they share the same language, they share the same model space, it's okay. And each of these services that's living inside this context, it can have its own database, or it can share the database. It's entirely up to the service. Just because a service is inside this bounded context doesn't mean that all services in this bounded context need to share the same database, but it doesn't have to. The main thing that is important is the language that's being used and the consistency. So talking about commands, going back, so command is something that you can use to send like another part of your bounded context to go do something. Now commands can fail. So just because you send a message doesn't mean that it can succeed. Unlike events, you only publish events when you know things have succeeded. So you send a command, it can fail or it can succeed. So you can take compensating actions on what you need to do if the command fails. So you can think about some of those design constraints as you're designing your system, like, how should your system behave if this command fails? So it puts all those decisions up front. So you're making like all of those decisions very explicit. So these are the two fundamental messages that I use. And so coming to the aircraft example, so I was thinking about this case where sometimes when airlines can change aircraft types. So they can, you could be scheduled to fly American, and it could be a Boeing 787 and the Dreamliner, and for whatever availability reason, they could switch you down to a Boeing 777. So in that case, the airline could want to notify you, could rebook send you like a proposal of like, this is the new proposal, what do you want to do, accept this or not. So would send you a notification. And you as a passenger can choose to say, hey, I don't like this, I'm going to cancel this because the Boeing 787 had flat business seats and the 777 has like angled business seats, and I don't like this, and I paid a lot of money, so just give me my. So there's a lot of things you could do. So let's take this, and this is what Norwegian Airlines did to me. They canceled like one of the flights, or they changed the routes, so I got a nice notification saying like, hey, here's your old one, here's your new one, tell me what to do. You want to keep this, or you can cancel and get your money back. So this is like somewhat of a real life example. So in this example, you have something I'm going to call it flight planning context that knows about flight scheduling and stuff. So it can publish an event saying like, hey, we're no longer going to use this, or we're moving from whatever, Boeing 787 to 777. So when that happens, it publishes an event. Aircraft type has changed. So the other context, the booking bounded context, can listen to that event and go, okay, so whenever this happens, I have in my booking process a lot of things that I need to do, like rebooking the customer, like notifying the customer and so on. So the keyword that I use to try to identify events is the word when. So when your domain people start talking to you about and then they start using the language like when something this happened. So the when kind of indicates hey, that's an event right there. So we need to keep that in mind. That's important language. So the other thing is, so events from one bounded context can start a process. There could be multiple messages that take part in it. So when the booking context receives that event, it can send a command to something internal to say, hey, go do the rebooking, and it can result in events that can trigger other bounded contexts. So you can have multiple messages taking part in a business process. So one of the things about business processes is that as these multiple messages combine, you have to have state, whether the fact that the customer is trying to cancel, or you have a new itinerary, you've sent a notification, and now you're waiting for that information. So your process needs to have state, and that's where there's this pattern called saga, and it's a messaging pattern, and that can be handy. So the way it works in Service Bus is a saga is something that handles is capable of handling multiple message types and has this useful state information that you can use to see, okay, if my state of the business process is, for example, you've turned on the grace period because you've notified the customer, then you mark that in the state saying I'm going to wait for 5 days. So that's some state information. So what happens, 5 days passes and the customer didn't get back? You need to do some compensating actions. So those are that's why it's useful to have the state. So in Service Bus, this is how the pattern is implemented. So what happens is a message comes in, and we know that message is going to create this new business process instance. So we have a new a saga instance, so to speak, which will new up the state object, and then the message gets dispatched. And when the message comes in, as part of that message handling, you might send other events, or you might publish events or send commands. So there could be other things, and you might record some interesting state information. And so that state is persisted in a persistence. It could be SQL persistence or whatever. So Service Bus will take that information and put that in the persistence. Now, when another message comes in, which belongs to that same business process, we need to rehydrate that state. So we have the saga, Service Bus has the saga ID, so it'll go fetch it from the database, and then part of fetching it, it also knows the exact state that the object was. So now here's your state, and now the message that came in can look at that state information and go, okay, so you've already received, the grace period was already given, and this didn't happen, so it's easy to make compensating actions. So message comes in, you, based on the state data, you decide what to do, and you could, complete the saga, in which case, that instance gets deleted from the persistence. This is kind of how Service Bus implements this pattern. So if you're not using Service Bus, that's completely fine, but this is done behind the scenes. The other .NET messaging framework is Mass Transit. That's open source. So if you're looking at like you want a messaging framework, you could use Mass Transit or NService Bus. Of course, I work for the company that makes NService Bus. So how do you model your business process? And you could do it using this process called event storming. Is anyone here like already familiar with event storming? Yeah. Okay. Yes, no. Okay. Some yes, some no. So event storming is actually a really cool process. And it was Alberto Brandolini, I hope I'm saying his name right, an Italian dude. And he came up with this process many years ago. And I kind of like started hearing about it, and I saw, like I was in one of the modeling workshops, and it was really cool. And so the basic premise is you try to identify all the events. So in your business process, like what are the interesting, most important things that is happening? So you try to record that, and you kind of like use Post-its. You use like the walls, you just throw some white paper and you pull your domain experts that know a lot about the models and architects, developers. So together, collaboratively, you try to identify what are the most important things that are happening in that process. So you take a sticky and you start posting on the whiteboard space. So people that are like, Alberto has his own color coding for like, you have to use an orange sticky for events and blue for commands. And, some people are very religious about it. I just use like, what's the most common available sticky? That's the yellow. So, just buy yellow and just have your own key. Like when you're doing this process, have a little key. Yellow means event. Blue means command. So it could be whatever Post-its are available at your workplace. So you identify this, and then you kind of like start okay, these things like fall in booking, or you kind of like have this idea. So the other cool thing about event storming is that whole idea of collaboration. And I found that to be so powerful, like not just for event storming, but using this sort of a technique and putting like, a visualization space on your wall and like just collaborating rather than sitting around in a table, and talking to each other, talking over each other. There's people like with ideas trying to get their thought out, but somebody else is speaking for the last 2 minutes, won't shut up. And that thought is like nagging inside your head. That sort of things like kind of gets to disappear because you have your modeling space. So you have your idea, you write that idea in a sticky, post it on the wall. So you don't have to lose that train of thought. And then whenever that person finishes, like you can say, hey, how about this? Or so your ideas are not lost. It's a seriously really cool way of collaborating, not just for event storming. So in event storming, once you've identified events, then you start asking yourself, like, what happens after this event happens? Or what should happen? And then you start like identifying those steps. So you go, okay, when the aircraft type is changed, I need to rebook, this thing, and that could result in another event. Booked flight was changed. And now, when the booked flight was changed, we need to notify the customer, send them an email, or send her an email. And now we have to wait for, 5 days. And within that time, like if we didn't hear back, booking is confirmed, or we could get an event, booking was canceled. So you start with the most important event first, and then you kind of build your story before and after. My direction is a bit messed up. But, and then you start looking at each of the commands there. Because commands can fail, you kind of start asking yourself, okay, what happens if I can't rebook this flight? And that may not be an answer that we as programmers or architects might know. That's something the business has to decide. And that's why it's super important for you to have the domain expert with you in the room, because then they can give you that feedback and say, oh, this is new process, according to this new process, like, as long as you notify the client, you're fine. Or they could give you some other rule that you probably possibly never thought about it before. And rather than modeling them as race conditions, by talking to the domain experts, you might actually come about knowing about a brand new rule that you have to model. So that's why it's important to have the domain expert when you're doing this exercise. But that's like event storming in like 5 minutes, but we could like do probably more in future meetups. We could have dedicated event storming sessions if that's something that you're interested in. But that's it in a nutshell. However, okay, so if we take that and start looking at code, how it actually looks, writing the code is like the simplest, easy part. So once you've identified this is what, so you have like a handler, and this handler is like invoked when the event arrives. This is N7 bus code. Mass transit code will probably look very, very similar. But the basic thing is when this event arrives, like what do we need to do? In this case, we might have to go and see like what are all the booking references that are affected by this aircraft change, and then we might need to send to rebook for each of those bookings. So we send this rebook flight command. The rebook flight command is also simple. Once it has, goes through this route engine and finds out like the best possible route, then it can go ahead and say, okay, here's the new proposal, and then say this flight was changed. And then you can have this saga thingy that listens to, okay, once the booked flight was changed, and it can also get a booking was canceled, and these are the three events that belong together because I need to take some compensating action when I have a cancellation. So you could just write all this code, and it's pretty simple. So what here is the hard part? The hard part here is naming things. And like as programmers, like we think that certain things, make sense to us, and it makes perfect sense to us at the time. But this is where like you need to talk more with your domain experts and express things in the language of the domain. And this is where like events like PDF document was generated. That's an event. I mean, it's in the past tense. It's a thing it's a statement of truth that's happened. But what is that PDF? That makes no sense. And so as programmers, we tend to kind of like start using like this techie language, JSON something, or like whatever is the new flavor, we try to use that language. But it's more important to use the language of the business, the domain. So and that's another important thing that domain-driven design teaches us. Like our models, no matter how smart we think we are, it's like our first take of the model will probably be wrong. And that's okay, because the only way it gets better is over time, and it evolves into the model it needs to be. And that's okay. And that's going to happen over time. And that's how it should be. All this agile, or if we refactor as we learn every day. So tomorrow you might have this model, you might go talk to your expert and she says something else. Then you need to take that information and go, okay, with this information, how does my model look like with this information? And if that's something new or different, you refactor. Yes, it's going to take some time. However, that cost that you're doing now with that small change is going to help you in the long run, because what's going to happen in the long run is your code is going to be more aligned with your business, with the domain. And so when they throw new requirements like, oh, when blah, blah, blah happens, your code is going to match very closely with the domain, and you know exactly where or what part of the model you might need to change. So let's take the same example before. We said that, or the requirements, the domain expert told us that they get a new booking proposal. But like when the aircraft type was changed, we called, or I called, the command rebook flight. There is no flight to be rebooked. There is just, we're just doing a proposal. It's a simple change, but it's keeping the language of the domain. We are actually proposing a rebooking, we're not rebooking. So, and it's not the booked flight was changed, it's the rebooking that was proposed. And we're not notifying customer about a flight change, but what we're doing is we're notifying customer about the proposed booking. So, and it's not the booking was confirmed, it was that the customer accepted your rebooking proposal. So all of a sudden, like your language is different. And yes, it's a change. Yes, you're going to have to redeploy, but it kind of keeps you consistent with what's actually happening in the domain, and you can talk the same language with your domain expert instead of like trying to talk French to a Spanish-speaking person and vice versa. So by having a common understanding, by using the same language, you're able to communicate better and implement those requirements in your software better when you communicate that way. So the other thing is like, of what I take from domain-driven design is like this healthy obsession with language. Like every proper DDD person that I've talked to, they obsess with language. They look at every single thing and go like, does this make sense? Should we call it this? And so in my original code, or for a long time, I used to always do this. I've written a lot of event handlers, and I always call my handler like after the event, like aircraft type was changed handler. So in my head, that meant like that's the piece of code that handles that event. And like I've named so many event handlers that way. However, if you really ask yourself, that doesn't tell you much as to what that thing is actually doing. So that thing is actually trying to propose a new rebooking. So the word handler is just an implementation detail. You don't need to have handler attached to the class name. You just say what that class was meant to do. So get rid of the handler, just make the class name actually tell you what it's doing. The other thing is like, I called it like booking change policy in my code. It wasn't like, or like I always tend to say booking policy saga, or like, you know, like I tag on saga to my class name just so it's a saga. But again, that's like an implementation detail, so to speak. Like start using names that actually make sense. In this case, it's defining or a grace period. It's the policy that, you know, deals about grace period for accepting rebookings, or proposals. So name matters. The other thing that I've so many times done in the past is like, I just use public get set. I mean, you define class for the event, and you have these public get set properties, and you're done. But events are immutable. Events are statements of fact that can't change. So why shouldn't your program, your code reflect that fact? It should. So you shouldn't be having any setters, especially public setters, in your messages. These are just, I mean, not just events, messages in general. Once a message has been sent, like whoever is receiving is just getting a copy of like that thing. So if they want to change, they're going to have to make a, you know, take that data, make something new, and go do something. They can't change the message or event or command that just came in. So make them immutable, get rid of the sets. So I tried this, and I got some exceptions, and I was like, wait a second, what's going on here? This is like the simplest thing to do. Take out the sets and make the constructor, you know, you have a public constructor that takes all the necessary properties, initialize them at construction, should be working fine. Like, Depends on what serializer you use. So if you use an XML serializer that's like really old, yes. So it can give you, little headaches. And then, with the XML serializer, I had to use a private set. So I was like, I still don't want to use a public set. So will a private set work? And it worked for the XML serializer. But I still wasn't happy. And I asked, I was like talking to friends, and one of my friends said, hey, there's this FODI add-in, and you just don't need to have these properties. It will do them automatically, for the serializer. It'll do it at the time of serial. So this is this magic, injection thing. It'll take care of it for you. And I know the guy who wrote FODI. So I asked him, hey, Simon, like, hey, I'm trying to do this, and what's this FODI thing, magic that, this person was talking about? And he was like, well, I abandoned that because you don't need that with JSON serializer. I'm like, thank you. So with JSON, so you have to deal with those things. And the competing heuristics to this is if a framework makes it really, really, really hard for you to do the right thing in domain-driven design, it's okay. Don't fight the framework. So in this case, I wasn't fighting the framework. It was like I was learning new stuff, which is okay. So I did find like, hey, I don't need setters in JSON serialization. It does the property name matching. So as long as your property matches the name in the constructor, JSON does that automatically for you, so you don't need any magic things there. So yeah, exactly. So the idea is, it's not just messages, but if there is like a concept in your domain which is immutable, for example, like once this policy is set, it can't be changed or something, make that explicit in your code. If somebody tries to set that, throw an exception. So whatever is the intent of the domain, try to model that in your code. So what happens if you get this new requirement that says, okay, this whole like idea of this giving people a new proposal, it's a big nightmare. We don't want everybody in economy class to get notified just because we don't care about those, people that pay cheap tickets. We only want to do this for, say, business class, or if you're like a platinum loyalty where you've flown like, thousands and thousands of miles each year and give us a lot of money, then we care about you and we want to give you this. So in this case, now you've got like booking, but you also have loyalty thing that knows about whether a passenger is like, gold or platinum or whatever. So that kind of brings up this interesting concept of temporal coupling. So you have this thing that needs to propose rebooking, and it receives this aircraft type as changed event. Now, our classic way would be is, hey, we need this data from this loyalty context. So we're going to ask it to say, hey, give me this information. Now, promote customer thingy in the loyalty context knows about it and says, oh yeah, okay, here's the status. And now proposed rebooking has enough information to make that decision of whether, they can or can't, and then take an action. So this is one way of doing it, where one bounded context is asking for information from the other bounded context. Now the problem here is, if for some reason loyalty context or that service is down or isn't around, booking can't make that decision. It has to wait until it gets that data. So this sort of coupling is called temporal coupling, where there's a sense of time involved, where one process cannot proceed with whatever its intent is until it gets back an answer from the other. So this is temporal coupling, and this is the killer that pretty much like makes your service like, like not autonomous. So because you can't take decisions on your own. You're reliant on something else. So this is also the piece that helps with your reliability. So this is where like one part of the system goes down, everything goes down because you can't take any actions. So this is also where like reliability comes in. So temporal coupling is like a very sort of important concept, and I kind of learned about it many years ago when I worked for this company, and we had grown. The model of the thing was like when a property gets foreclosed, there's a lot of regulation that's involved in notifying the homeowner. This like that needs to stand in court. So it's a big, huge process. And back in whatever 2007 and 8, where there were like tons and tons of properties that were being foreclosed, that company's business model was sending notifications. So they were like booming because they were having to fulfill all these notifications to these homeowners, and it was crazy. So all of a sudden, like the volume grew, and the system needed to take a lot of load, and there was only so much you could do. And so we hired somebody from Microsoft who did this architecture analysis, and we're like, your systems are temporally coupled. And like, okay, what's that? And that was like, it kind of like opened up like a whole new set of, I need to learn about this. And because knowing about it kind of helps you realize like, if you want to make your systems go faster, if you want to scale, if you want them to be reliable, you need to be able to identify these parts in your system that have this problem. So knowing about this problem kind of makes you like go look at parts of your system where this can happen. And so how do we solve this? So we can make autonomous decisions by using, again, event-driven architecture. So you have the loyalty thing, you have the booking thing. Now, if loyalty was publishing events saying like, hey, customer was promoted to gold, or customer was promoted to platinum, so the message booking is just listening to those events, and whenever that happens, it has its own persistent store, and it kind of maintains that information. Okay, customer X, the status. And now, when the flight planning context publishes this aircraft type is changed, booking does not have to go back to loyalty to get that information. Booking has its own store where it can just check and see what it needs to do. So it doesn't have to wait. It can take an autonomous decision based on the data it has. The most important thing that this pattern will make explicit is that data is going to be stale whether you like it or not. This whole notion of, I want the most correct data now, so I'm going to make this request and get back the data and go do this thing, doesn't work, because the minute something gives you the request, some other thing can go in there and change that state. So you're never operating with data. You are going to always be operating in the stale data. But in this model, it kind of makes that very explicit and raises very important questions. Like, okay, so what happens if, how long do we wait? Let's say, the loyalty was updated, but our booking system, it'll take like 2 days to update that within our booking systems. Is that acceptable? Business will be like, yeah, okay. So there may be like 1 or 2 customers that got missed out. Or what should we do? Should we offer them the new one or the old one? Or, when we find this discrepancy, do we do some other action? These are very important questions that needs to be asked, and only the domain expert knows. But by having a design like this, you are bubbling all those questions up to the front, where you're able to ask the person how the business needs to react. So in this model, deployment becomes simpler, where let's say you have the aircraft type, you had version 1, and now they're saying, okay, yeah, not just platinum customers, gold customers as well. So you write this module. You don't have to stop one and deploy. You could have the old one running, and you could deploy the new 1.1 version. and then kind of see how messages are behaving. Some messages might go to your old instance, some messages will go to your new instance, and you monitor your systems to see everything is working fine. If everything is working fine, then you go ahead, decommission the old endpoint, and then you're good. But that's really the super happy case, right? We all know what happens sometimes when we deploy. So when you deploy the new one and something goes awfully wrong, so what do? That message that this thing was processing doesn't get lost. It gets forwarded to a separate, like a container queue for these messages. So these messages don't go away. They still are in some safe space. Now you need to decommission the bad one, the badly broken one that gives you null reference exceptions, because no amount of how many times you process that message, it's not going to succeed. So now you decommission that. Now what do? So you have these messages that are sitting in the error queue, but you could just simply take them and throw them back in the queue. Because your original endpoint is running, it's going to process, and so you don't lose much time. And then you go figure out like what's happening with that exception, and you go and you process, like, you know, fix the bug, and then you repeat process. So the most important thing in this sort of, you know, event-driven architecture world, where you start using events and start breaking things into small pieces, is monitoring. Now, in this new model, we're saying that, hey, we don't care if loyalty is up and running or not. Booking can function on its own. And same thing with loyalty, it doesn't require other parts of the system. So at a glance, it might look like everything is working fine. But there could be a very small part of your system that's actually having some problems. So if you don't have your monitoring where your things set up, like how are these services, are they processing the messages, or when was the last time it processed messages, or hey, there's a lot of messages in the error queue and it's all by this end. So if you're not looking at that, you might have this idea that, hey, everything is working fine, but there could be this very small portion of your code, of your system, that's not working fine. Or you could have a big giant monolithic application where you immediately are going to know when everything fails, but that's not the point. So what I want you, if there's something that I want you to take, is 3 things, which is first and foremost, writing code is easy, but getting all this information is the most difficult part. So talk to the domain experts, involve them very heavily, do processes like event storming to kind of like brainstorm, get the idea, and try to model the business process together. And models are not perfect. We are not going to come up with a perfect model, and it's completely okay to keep refining them and keep deploying them. So if a company says, oh, we're agile, but then give you like a lot of crap about like, oh, sorry, this is like a technical debt, we don't have that time for the schedule, they're not really agile, or they're not trying to do DDD. So that's a challenge, that's an organizational challenge that a lot of us face, and that requires a lot of conversations and trying to make this understandable by the stakeholders. So obsess about your domain language, look at your models. If you find there's something that changed in that space, try to model that in your code. Don't do that, don't wait for it. Just keep your models as relevant to what the domain expert says. And in order to have autonomy, you really have to use events to break things apart. And breaking them apart kind of gives you these boundaries for what things can be autonomous, what things can run on its own versus what things can't. So if there are 3 things that I want you to take today with you, these are the 3 things that I want to share. And my company has graciously given this link. So this gives you access to Udi Dahan's course, one of the videos in the course. So Udi talks about like how to properly look at service boundaries and goes into some of the nuances. So this is something that you can go to and have a look at the videos. And I wanted to thank Particular for making sure I was able to be here. And thanks Gomti for having me. Thank you.
For the sponsorship. We wouldn't have this space if they wouldn't support.
Thanks. Thank you. And of course, I'm around, so if you have any questions, feedback, please use the feedback wall and give me feedback. I'd love to take this and information and improve this talk at Explore DDD and also KCBC.
Right. I don't need any feedback. I'm perfect. I need feedback. I just, I've only spoken in offices in non-track sessions. This is my first public speaking experience. So give me some tips.
I do have questions.
Yes.
Somebody right in particular. I know Udi Dahan does both training. You're talking about domain-driven design, specifically on the context. And I know Udi Dahan does training on service-oriented architecture.
Yeah.
The question I always had, I guess I'm only going to tell everybody. What's the difference of separating things by context and then actually separating things by service as a service-oriented architecture?
I think it's just all in the name. Like if you really look at it, I look at it as like a thing that makes sense for me. Like what Don Box, had the tenets of service-oriented architecture. Services have boundaries. Services share schema, not implementation. That's like how you share messages and stuff. So to me, I look at that and go, like a lot of times people get confused between what they see as a service as something that's deployable. Like if I have a Windows service running, that's a service. And then they go, wait, so does that make a bounded context? And then you start getting confused. So for me, I look at it as the bounded context is where something is consistent with the language too of the model. And it can have several services be part of that space. And it can have several databases that it doesn't all need to share the same database. But that's kind of how I look at it. And for me, when I hear Udi talk about services, to me, I kind of equate that as that service is actually like the bounded context in DDD. So that's the mapping that I did. Yes.
Yeah, I would think of it more of as the bounded context is a kind of a higher level design concept that once you've defined a bounded context, then that can, and the microservice or service is an implementation concept. And so you can say, oh, well, I'm going to take this bounded context and implement it as a microservice. Or you might take the bounded context and implement it a different way, but it just, it can be used to facilitate identifying what could be possibly be used as a service.
I was going to say, to expand on that a little bit, in my understanding, as you were saying, it depends on the granularity that you're looking at it. Domain-driven design as a principle, as a designing pattern, you're looking at the bounded context of the domain. You're speaking in terms of the domain that you're working in. Service-oriented architecture goes into the implementation details of how are you setting up your architecture, what services are you creating to represent and acknowledge and work with those bounded contexts. So what you do is you design for the domain and you let your domain tell you where those service boundaries are going to be. So especially when it comes, one of the things we do a lot of at Headspring is breaking apart monoliths, doing a lot of modernization efforts. And when you take that monolith and you have to kind of derangle all of the spaghetti code that's been built up over 10, 15, 20 years of old legacy code, you have to go through that whole design process and say, okay, these are the bounded contexts, right. And then you start refactoring and pulling apart the code into the services that represent those contexts.
I
I like the title says that bounded context plus events is microservices.
Right.
And the reason microservice, because a lot of times people will confuse and say, oh, microservice sits on top of a bounded context, which is not true. A bounded context could have multiple services.
Right.
It's just an implementation detail on top of the bounded context.
Right.
And when you're saying service there, you mean a physical
Yeah.
Thing.
deployable system.
Right. Deployable
And-
thing.
and when I
Right.
think
Process. Right.
When I think SOA, I'm not necessarily, I mean, maybe this is wrong,
Yeah.
I think SOA, I'm not necessarily talking about a single deployable system.
Right. It's yeah. Like like in Udi's course, he talks about like the concept of BCs or business components. Like he always talks about a service as a thing that owns that business capability. So yeah, this language is very similar. So to me, when I think about the overarching like service boundary, I kind of like tend to think about that overarching service boundary as the bounded context in DDD world. So that's the mapping that I make. And thanks, Gomthi. Like I completely forgot like the total end part of my talk, which is like, hey, if you do bounded context and if you use events to talk to each other and if you make things autonomous, then what you have is a microservice. But I didn't say that.
It's probably better if you don't say that. So there's going to be more confusion.
So can I say that, and I don't know if I heard this from you, but I have some kind of faded memory saying communication using services or communicating through messages. Is there an advantage over using messages over services? I could see if I am using, say, an endpoint of service, I'm bound to that endpoint. But if it's just a message. But I feel like, well, I'm bound to the message also. If the message changes.
Yes, you can have dependency on the schema because schema is something that you're sharing. Actually, I could show you. So let's see. Can everybody read this? Yeah, okay. So like, for example, let me go back to my original. Yeah, this one. So I had this, this is like my first model, whatever. So I had this thing called messages DLL, and I like, in this like project, so I have like aircraft type was changed, booked flight was changed, etc., etc., etc. But like, when you're actually doing this, these events like don't go in one DLL. If you really think about this, you have to ask yourself like who owns these, and so you might want to split them as like events that specifically belong to booking or flight planning, because that's the thing that you're going to share, and in there you don't put your commands because that's not something that you share with other bounded contexts. So you are only sharing like what's public, and yes, you can. That's one of the like people say, I use messaging and therefore I get very loosely coupled systems. But you could on paper get loosely coupled systems, but then if your events are like has a lot of properties, and now it's like the other system is like expecting that, and then you go change that schema and the other system is relying on that information, bad stuff can happen. So that's like another important part about bounded contexts, right? So when you're trying to integrate between different bounded contexts, you have to come to a common understanding that like it's like how much information am I willing to leak from this context? And that's super important. So if you think about that and say, how much am I willing to leak? How much am I willing to share? Then you have a lot more thought into that, because then you know that if that whatever changes or if you're trying to add more information, how that's going to impact. Yes, so that's a very good question. And yes, you can get tangled up in the message schema.
There is, I think it should be an anti-pattern, but I've seen that sometimes there will be a separate DLL that has all these messages, and then somebody who's consuming the messages references that DLL and gets tightly coupled to that, implementation detail of those messages instead of just depending on the actual message.
Right. So that would be like Don Box's share schema, not implementation. So I look at messages as more like a DTO or something that just has these properties that you're willing to share. So if you're interested, since I wrote this code, I can actually kind of run it and show you how this works. So I have this proposed rebooking thing, which is like the Saga that listens to the, oops. And then I have like this UI thing that triggers like different events. So if I press A, then that's going to indicate that the aircraft type was changed. So, and the process behind is the proposed new rebooking. So, so I press A, and here's the Saga. It received the aircraft thing, and it did the proposed rebooking. And now it's like, sent the email, and it's waiting for the grace period. I set the time as like 15 seconds. So after 15 seconds, it gets the event, and now the Saga is complete. And the most important part about this is like actually the unit tests. So with, here's the Saga code. So I have grace period for accepting rebookings, and it started by this event. Rebooking was proposed, and you can also listen to booking was canceled, because you could propose a rebooking, but if the customer went ahead and canceled that, then there's nothing you need to do. So you need to like listen to that event. And also there's this whole concept of, hey, I want to wait a period of like X days. So when the event happens for when you receive the rebooking was proposed, you know, first you do this data thing is like the in-service bus state object, where you can like put things in there to remember state. So this is the object that will be rehydrated when another event comes in that you can take decisions on. So we're saying, yeah, we received the rebooking proposed, and we want to remember this booking reference ID in the state. And we can't complete the Saga yet because we just got this event. But what we need to do is we need to notify the customer about the rebooking, and we're also going to wait like, I don't know, 5 days. And then we go and say, okay, when the timeouts is like the concept that in-service bus Saga pattern implements. So that's like whenever the requested time elapses, it sends your Saga a message, like a wake-up call, like a wake-up reminder. And so the message comes in, and then it wakes your Saga up. The state gets rehydrated. And now when that timeout happens, you can go, okay, I haven't received any cancellation in this period. I could just go ahead and confirm that this is the rebooking that we're going to go with. So this is the Saga code. But what's really more important, I mean, of course, the Saga code is important, but you have tests. So you can write proper unit tests where you can say, okay, when the rebooking was proposed, what we're going to do is we have to assert that this actually notified the customer. So we trigger a rebooking was proposed event and say, hey, Saga, go handle this. So this is the state. And now we're checking like part of the handler if like, you know, we sent out 2 messages, and one of them is like the notify customer about proposed rebooking, and you know, and we can assert about certain information in that message, and so on. So the other thing you can do is like if the other message, like you know, you're doing a timeout, so you can actually trigger the timeout. And so rather than like changing code, making it 15 seconds, whatever. So here you could actually trigger the timeout and check whether the logic in your timeout handler is working. You can also assert that sometimes, like, I didn't do this here, but sometimes your policy might be like 5 days, and then in the code, you changed it to 15 seconds just to test it, but you know, you checked in and triggered a build, but your unit test can fail because it can say that like my expected time to wait was 5 days. and the test failed because the code had 15 seconds. So you could do things like that to make sure that like all the cases that are happening in your Saga or your business process is actually unit tested. And you see, I got a bunch of greens, so my test work. Thanks. Thank you. Very good. So are you taking a break?
Yeah, any advice going from domain-driven design back to a model?
Come talk to me. We'll have that chat outside.
The next door down?
I think you need to start by deleting all your tests.
It's going to involve a lot of alcohol. Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So listening to all this, I still have a big problem, or I see a gap in terms of we speaking here more like in technical terms. I bet that 90% of attendees here are engineers. I may be wrong, but I'm an engineer myself. And the problem I see is that we engineers try to come up with these concepts and approaches like domain-driven design, and then we in very few words, very briefly touch the problem that we also have to educate the domain experts so that they have the ubiquitous language, the connecting piece between us and them. That's like very vital. And
Right.
the problem I have is that I have not seen in the industry, not on this talk specifically, I understand it's a limited focus, but I have not seen big focus and effort like strengthening that part
Yes.
and keeping the connection as well as educating the domain experts
Right.
about the importance of it. And how do you see, and I can open up that question to the rest of the audience as well here, how do you see that you personally, being that solve, us not focusing on the code, but instead like realizing that domain experts should as well care about, we do care about this, I see.
Right.
We are technical people, we talk about this, we have the meetups. I don't think that domain experts, I don't think that product owners and stakeholders,
Yes.
they meet and talk about ubiquitous language. I don't think so. And I bet that never has happened so far. Well, how do you see that solved? How do you see the other part being in the situation to understand the problems we are trying to solve and understanding their own important role in that whole development?
With one of the clients' companies that I was tagging along during the event storming workshop, what they did was it was like a DDD training that I had the privilege of just like being a silent person and watching the whole interaction. What I learned from that was like the original, like the DDD training or whatever was split with just the engineers. But then the part of the event storming workshop, like the business people were invited to the meeting. And so when the event storming first started, like some of the business stakeholders were like kind of like, standing back and like, why am I in this room? Like, what am I doing here? Like, you bunch of engineers, sort of thing. But then as the event storming kind of progressed, it wasn't more about like, we're going to teach you DDD. It's more about, I have this business process I'm trying to understand. And kind of like when we start talking about like, hey, these are the most important things and what can fail. So the language sort of comes, along, and then we just mark them as like Post-its with this is what we want to record and so on. So to me, that collaboration, I mean, it really opened up, like in that room, like both the engineers and some of the product people realized that they had this, like a strange understanding. Like, the person was saying like, this is how the code works. And the guy go, like there's this obscure rule and it shouldn't work this way. And then people going like, oh my God, so if you don't have those sort of discussions, like our code is always going to be wrong, or we don't think, or we might over-engineer. But that's really where I have seen business people like come like together and work. And like during that process, like we found that, there was like a whole idea of a context that was missing a person in a support role, and that how that had caused problems in the software, and that also became visible. So yes, you are right, it is hard, but like perhaps like, take a small process that's critical in the system, and then start asking, what is the pains around this process? So try to understand, like, what are the most painful parts of that process, and then try to event storm like in a visual space that opens up like the dialogue a lot more than like, hey, we're trying to do domain-driven design, and we want to use this ubiquitous language, and then you kind of lose people. So, but the whole idea is like, you want to have that sort of collaboration. So inviting people to the meetings, the important stakeholders kind of helps. And what I also learned from the interaction was like visually modeling anything is just so useful, and it brings up like a whole bunch of insights than just like sitting and speaking like in a conference table around a room. So once you lay a paper out and say, hey, start posting stickies, like it could be something as like, okay, why aren't we able to deploy faster? Like, okay, so let's see what are the modules that we have going on right now. So you start like, and then start like, okay, why can't like we deploy this? Because, oh wait, the other team, hasn't, like I'm waiting on the API for that team to finish. Like, okay, why isn't that team able to finish? And that's because like, and then you start finding some answers that might be like, hey, perhaps like the company should prioritize what's the most important goal. And that sort of like bubbles up as a result of that, visualization meeting. So so to me, it's like trying to visualize things with the right people in the room, that helps. And trying to tell them, hey, we understand it's kind of weird, but we're just trying to understand the actual process, make sure that our understanding is both correct, and can we have this discussion? So the other thing where like event storming is also hugely helpful is like when a new engineer comes on board, do an event storming about like what your software is or the most important parts together as a group. Then it's like better than documentation, which is always stale, but now you're spreading this knowledge like, as a group. And the question that people ask is like, how do I store this artifact of this event storming? Because like you've gone through this exercise and stuff, but the artifact is really in your heads, and it's the shared knowledge and the shared communication and understanding that you have. And depending on who you event storm with, of course, the results will be varied, will be biased because of the different opinions that you have. And that's also okay. But it increases this shared knowledge of the domain. So I kind of look at that going like, yeah, I've seen that work, and yes, we can. And that's why I really love that process. And that's something that I learned like last year's Explore DDD. I was in Matthias's workshop for day one, and I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Yeah.
Jason attended actually event storming workshop.
With Alberto? Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
That's great.
Oh yeah, so you can share, yes.
You said something about that workshop where he says that the first part of the workshop or the exercise is chaos.
Yes,
And the discomfort
yes.
of being in the space to talk.
Yeah.
One of the things he points out, like he even recommends that have like a ringer in there to start. So you talk to somebody, you say you got to go put up the first move
Right.
to kind of get it. But the getting it started is one part of the whole thing, and then if you get past that, it's just start putting stuff on there. Like just give a very vague direction of what a word sticky is.
Yeah.
And then start putting it on the board, and then slowly over time they'll introduce the idea that this is time, so left right is time.
Right.
And then slowly over time, just kind of they'll figure it out, and you'll see them. and it organizes itself, and you get from chaos to context.
Right.
And domain.
Maybe going back to previous question, it's like kind of reverse of that. So say, for example, when you go to a client for discovery and then you do some kind of strategy design, who are the right participants there? Because I see a lot of times development missing in that part. Like, should they be there, or are the business folks the relevant people there?
Yeah, it's like, gosh, it depends from organization to organization. I used to work for an organization where, even though I was like a senior engineer, like design was like handed over, like it was like a really waterfall-y type of thing, where like you had the systems people like, you know, do UML diagrams and have their own meetings, and then go to the design people, and then when it came to the programming people, it's like, hey, here's the document, go do this. And you know, like, okay, but what if I have questions, or like, what do you think about this? And like, hey, you're just a programmer, like these people thought about this. So it's, and then in another company, it's like, you know, when we had the training for the stuff, I don't know, the VP of architecture decided like only architects are going to be in this training. And I'm going, no, like it's useful for like developers to be in this, to gain this understanding, not just architects. And then, but that didn't happen. And, you know, we had Udi come the second time because the development team was not very unhappy, and they paid for Udi to come back again and redeliver the ADSD course, and thinking like, you could have done this the first time. So it, you know, and I think that's kind of where you have to like see the organization culture. And in my opinion, if you like, you know, to me, if you're working on the system, like you have a stake. So I don't see why you shouldn't be part of the conversation. To me, the best decisions happen when like we as whatever architects or developers and, you know, talk to the business people. We, in fact, don't want to name, but we wrote this version of the product, and it was like, you know, they hired some dude for the UX experience, and we drew like lots of boxes and things, and the whole thing got implemented. And the person that was actually supposed to use that thing, she's like, I can't use this. Like, this doesn't do like X, Y, Z. Nobody, like, you know, thought about asking her. Like, the thing was intended for. And she was like, this is crap. I can't do this. And then so there was version 2. And then, you know, there was a big meeting where like she was involved, and whatever. Like, there was like, you know, the kickoff had like all the right people. Yeah, so it really helps, but sometimes we learn the hard way, and there are organizations that are willing to recognize that and go, okay, you know, we need more of this, and then, you know, it's sometimes you tend to work with like managers, or I don't know, like people of higher authority who fight you, and then it becomes difficult. And I feel like, you know, that's kind of where what you were talking about, like, you know, when you introduced yourself and how you were saying empathy is very important. Like, I think communication skill is a huge, like, you know, trying to persuade people, that's like equally important as learning how to do async await in C# to me, because like, you know, you can have this code, but at the end of the day, if that meaningful work doesn't reach your customer in a meaningful way, it's useless. And I worked on so many projects that have gotten canned. And my first project that when I came from the US, it was for a big giant hospital. And I mean, people had worked on the requirements for like more than a year. And I mean, it was like the back-end team was in Oakland, and the front-end team was in Pasadena, and there was like a whole bunch of IBM, anybody in IBM? Sorry, if I'm offending you. Okay. But like, you know, it was run differently, and the problem was, at the end of the day, when the front-end team wanted to make changes, it was so hard to change. The back-end team was under pressure, And they were like, I'm sorry, like the changes you want, we can't do. Like, okay, we're just going to round trip this thing. And it used like every technology you can think of, like XML, Corba, because whatever reason, didn't want to use COM at the time, even though it was like a Microsoft, thing. And it used all of those stuff, talking to an Oracle database deployed in a data center. And then this was meant for doctors, okay? And when the doctor is technically supposed to pull the patient's record and go, okay, yeah, and then sign off on it. So the pulling the patient's record, like when we tested with the production data, it took 8 minutes. Okay, it took 8 minutes. And like, which doctor has that kind of time? So yeah, the project got canned after several $1 million, and it was because of communication. And so a lot of organizations spend a lot of money, but they need to realize that the statistics is a large amount of projects fail. And I feel like if you are someone in the organization that can like have the power of persuasion, and even if you don't have that power of persuasion, like kind of read more books about some of those things and techniques, and try to work with people and have like that to me is one of the most important skills that you can have as an architect, as a developer, because you're going to have to convince your stakeholders, if you're a developer, your architect, and so on. So, and that's where empathy helps, because when you frame the questions as like from a place of trying to know more so than I told you so. But I understand sometimes it is difficult. I have quit I don't know, maybe at least once, because I just couldn't make it work. And that's something that we have to deal with as well. There's so much we can take, and when you find yourself in an organization that really doesn't want to like invest in you, then there's like there comes a point where you have to make that call and go, this is not the right fit for me. So it's a lot of hard decisions, for sure.
And these techniques, I mean, like you're talking about stuff like domain-driven design and separating things out like context, they're ubiquitous language, they're linked to the politics of government.
Yes.
Because the more you gather things by context and organize your systems, the more you probably change somebody else's job.
Yep.
And that's really difficult for people to deal with. And I think Martin Fowler, he was giving some talk, and he was saying when we come into a company and they want to do service-oriented architecture, many times it's very difficult because we find organizational fighting.
Yeah.
And basically he says, you really can't do a whole lot with that if you're at a place that you're a technical person. All you really can do is keep making great systems and keep delivering, and hopefully with time gain enough influence.
Yeah.
But these techniques are tied to the politics of the company.
So really good books are like, I think it's called The Power of Persuasion by, it's a Guy Kawasaki, or I don't know, it's Guy Kawasaki. He's a guy that used to work in Apple, and that book is really, really cool. Talks about persuasion as a skill. And there's books like Dan Ariely's Simply Irrational or Predictably Rational. And it's like, how we human beings think we're very, very logical beings, and we, tend to take logical decisions, or simply can be easily persuaded to take the wrong decision by, like, by presenting a certain set of facts. And so it's a really seriously cool book. If you haven't had a chance to read, highly recommend it. So these are like books outside of DDD, but can help you, try to work through the organizational hiccups.
So, I was thinking we take maybe 5-10 minutes break and start our morning exercise.
Sure.
We do around like 40 minutes
Yeah.
on our exercise. We'll split in the groups, and we have a business problem. We'll just try to model it.
Yeah, we can take the same flight example thing and try to come up with models. And some of us can act as domain experts within the group, and it doesn't have